December 7th, 1941. 5,000 miles from Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat in the operations room of the battleship Nagato, waiting for confirmation that his carrier strike force had hit Pearl Harbor. Around him, staff officers tracked the progress of the attack through radio intercepts and scout plane reports. The plan was working. American battleships were burning in their berths, but Yamamoto's face showed no triumph. He turned to his chief of staff and said something that would define Japan's entire strategic reality for the next 4 years. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." The quote has been debated by historians, its exact wording uncertain. But what isn't uncertain is what Yamamoto had been saying for months before the attack, in meetings and correspondence that were documented and survived the war. He had told anyone who would listen that Japan could win battles against America for perhaps 6 months, maybe a year. After that, American industrial power would overwhelm them. He had studied at Harvard, served as a naval attaché in Washington, traveled across America. He had seen the oil fields of Texas, the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the automobile factories of Detroit. He knew what Japan was about to face, and he knew something else, something that Japanese military planners had concluded in study after study, in strategic assessment after strategic assessment, something that shaped every decision Japan made in the Pacific War. Invading the American mainland was impossible, not difficult, not risky, not inadvisable, impossible. The question is, when did they realize this? What did they actually say about it? And what were the cold, hard facts that made it so undeniable that even Japan's most aggressive militarists never seriously planned to land troops on American soil? The answer begins years before Pearl Harbor, in the offices of Japan's Army and Navy general staffs, where officers studied maps and calculated tonnages and came to conclusions that terrified them. 1936. The Japanese Army and Navy were locked in their perpetual rivalry, but on one thing they agreed. They needed to understand what war with America would actually look like. Not the propaganda version, not the hopeful version. The real version with real numbers and real logistics and real geography. A small group of officers, sworn to secrecy, began a study. They had access to intelligence on American industrial capacity, military strength, and geographic advantages. They had their own fleet and army capabilities. They had maps and calculators and honest assessments of what Japan could and couldn't do. Their conclusion was documented in a report that circulated among senior commanders. The exact document was likely destroyed in the war's final days, but its conclusions were referenced in post-war testimonies and memoirs. The study found that Japan lacked the merchant shipping, naval power, and logistical capacity to sustain an invasion of the American mainland. More than that, even if Japan somehow landed troops on American soil, the defenders would outnumber them catastrophically. The numbers were stark. Japan's entire merchant fleet in 1941 totaled roughly 6 million tons. America's shipbuilding capacity alone could produce more than that in a single year. Japan's steel production was approximately 7 million tons annually. America's was 70 million tons. Japan produced around 2,000 aircraft per year. America's factories, once converted to war production, could build that many in a month. But the truly insurmountable problem was distance and geography. From Tokyo to San Francisco was roughly 5,000 miles of open ocean. Japan's largest naval operation ever attempted, the Pearl Harbor strike, had required 6 fleet carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, 3 submarines, and 8 tankers just to hit a single target and return. The carriers had to refuel multiple times. The operation had pushed Japanese logistics to their absolute limit. Now imagine not a single strike, but an invasion. An amphibious assault on a defended coastline, requiring not hundreds of aircraft, but thousands. Not a few thousand sailors and pilots, but hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Not a quick strike, but a sustained campaign requiring constant resupply of ammunition, food, fuel, medical supplies, and reinforcements. The logistics were nightmarish. Every soldier would need food, water, ammunition. Every tank would need fuel. Every gun would need shells. All of it would have to cross 5,000 miles of ocean where American submarines and aircraft could attack the supply lines. Japan didn't have enough merchant ships to supply such an operation, while also maintaining its economy at home and its armies in China. That assumed Japan could actually land troops successfully, which assumed they could achieve naval and air superiority off the American coast, which assumed the U.S. Pacific Fleet would somehow not exist to oppose them. Admiral Nagano, the Navy Chief of Staff, understood this perfectly. In meetings with Prime Minister Tojo in 1941, as Japan debated whether to go to war with America, Nagano was blunt. Japan could fight a defensive war in the Pacific. They could seize resource areas in Southeast Asia and try to hold them. They could try to make the war so costly that America would negotiate peace. But they could not invade America. They could not occupy American territory. They could not win a war of attrition against American industry. Tojo, the army general who became prime minister, was more aggressive, but even he never proposed invading California or Washington or Oregon. The army's plans focused entirely on China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands. The idea of landing Japanese soldiers on American soil appeared nowhere in their strategic planning. It wasn't even considered ambitious. It was considered fantasy. The closest Japan came to touching American territory was the Aleutian Islands. In June 1942, as a diversion during the Midway operation, Japanese forces occupied Attu and Kiska, two remote islands in the Aleutian chain off Alaska. These were barren rocks with no strategic value, inhabited by a handful of people, defended by no one. Japan held them for over a year. It took roughly 10,000 troops to garrison these tiny islands. Supplying them was a constant struggle. When American forces finally retook them in 1943, the Japanese defenders were starving, low on ammunition, cut off from reinforcement. If Japan struggled to hold two uninhabited rocks 1,000 miles from American population centers, what hope did they have of invading the mainland? But the strategic impossibility went deeper than just logistics. It was about what they would face if they somehow managed to land. Japanese intelligence had accurate assessments of American military potential. In 1941, the U.S. Army numbered around 1.5 million men. Small by later standards, but growing rapidly. More importantly, America had a population of over 130 million people. Japan's population was roughly 70 million, and millions of Japanese men were already tied down fighting in China. America could mobilize an army of millions. Japan knew this because they'd seen American mobilization in World War I, when the U.S. had put 4 million men under arms in less than 2 years. In this war, American mobilization would be even larger. By 1945, America would have over 12 million people in uniform, but even more daunting than the military was the civilian population. Japanese planners knew that Americans owned firearms, lots of firearms. Estimates suggested tens of millions of rifles, shotguns, and pistols in private hands. Japan had strict gun control. Its civilian population was largely unarmed. America's was armed to the teeth. In 1942, after the Doolittle raid hit Tokyo, Japanese newspapers ran stories about American terror bombing and the need to resist invasion. But privately, military planners understood the reality. If Japanese troops somehow landed in California, they wouldn't just face the U.S. military. They'd face armed civilians, farmers with deer rifles, shopkeepers with pistols, veterans of the last war who knew how to shoot. An invasion of America would be an invasion of 130 million people, millions of them armed, all of them hostile, fighting on their own soil. The geography made it worse. America was vast. From the Atlantic to the Pacific, roughly 3,000 miles. From Canada to Mexico, roughly 1,500 miles. Nearly 4 million square miles of territory, much of it mountains, deserts, forests, rivers. Japan couldn't even fully control China, and they'd been trying for years. How could they possibly control a country twice as large, with twice the population and infinitely more industrial capacity? Admiral Yamamoto understood this in his bones. He had driven across America in the 1920s, when he was a naval attaché. He had seen the highways stretching to the horizon, the farms producing more food than Japan could imagine, the factories that seemed to go on forever. He'd watched Ford's assembly lines turning out automobiles by the thousands. He knew those same factories could turn out tanks and planes just as fast. In the months before Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto argued against war with America. He told the Naval General Staff that Japan couldn't win. He said that even if Japan won every battle for a year, America's industrial power would eventually crush them. He was overruled by officers who believed that Japanese fighting spirit would overcome material disadvantages. But Yamamoto never believed it. He knew the numbers. He'd seen the factories. After Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto's strategy was defensive, not offensive. Seize a defensive perimeter in the Pacific. Fortify islands, make America pay a high price for every mile of ocean. Hope that American public opinion would tire of the war and accept a negotiated peace. Never did he plan to invade America. Never did he suggest it was possible. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 confirmed everything Yamamoto feared. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers in a single day. These were the same carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. They represented years of construction, thousands of trained pilots, irreplaceable striking power. America, meanwhile, was already building new carriers. The Essex-class carriers were under construction, each one larger and more capable than Japan's best. America would eventually build 24 of them. Japan would never replace the 4 it lost at Midway. After Midway, Japanese strategy became purely defensive. Hold what they had. Delay the American advance. Make every island costly to take. But never, ever did they plan to take the war to American soil. The Battle of Guadalcanal, which began in August 1942, showed Japanese planners another harsh reality. America could project power across the Pacific. They could land troops on distant islands. They could supply those troops indefinitely. They could build airfields and bases and infrastructure. Japan struggled to supply its garrison on Guadalcanal, just 2,000 miles from their main base at Rabaul. The soldiers called their supply runs the Rat Run because ships could only approach at night, unload hastily, and flee before dawn. Many soldiers starved. By the time Japan evacuated Guadalcanal in February 1943, they'd lost over 20,000 men, many to disease and starvation. If Japan couldn't supply an island 2,000 miles from their base, how could they supply an invasion force 5,000 miles away, landing on a hostile continent? In Tokyo, the realization was setting in among even the most optimistic officers. This war would not end with Japanese troops marching through American cities. It would end, if Japan was lucky, with a negotiated peace that let them keep some of their conquests. More likely, it would end with Japan's defeat. General Tojo, the Prime Minister, remained publicly confident, but in private meetings, documented in diaries kept by other officials, his tone was different. He spoke of making the war too costly for America to continue. He spoke of defending Japan's home islands. He never spoke of invading America. The idea had moved from impossible to unthinkable. By 1943, as American forces advanced through the Pacific, Japanese strategy focused entirely on defense. The absolute defense line was established, running through the Marianas, Carolines, and western New Guinea. This would be where Japan made its stand. But even this line was too ambitious. American forces smashed through it in 1944, taking the Marianas and putting B-29 bombers within range of Japan's home islands. The Marianas campaign showed another aspect of American power that Japanese planners had underestimated: the speed of American construction and logistics. When American forces took Saipan in June 1944, they found Japanese defenders who'd been cut off from resupply for months. Within weeks of securing the island, American engineers had built massive airfields, complete with fuel depots, ammunition storage, repair facilities, and housing for thousands of personnel. B-29s were bombing Japan by November, just 5 months after the island was taken. Japan took years to build what America built in months. This disparity in construction capability alone made invasion of America impossible. Even if Japanese troops somehow landed in California, American engineers would be building fortifications, airfields, and infrastructure faster than Japanese forces could advance. The strategic bombing campaign that began in late 1944 brought home another reality. America could strike Japan with impunity. B-29s flying from the Marianas could reach Tokyo, drop their bombs, and return. Japan's air defenses were inadequate. Its fighters couldn't reach the altitude where B-29s flew. Even when they did intercept, American bombers had fighter escorts with drop tanks that gave them range Japan couldn't match. If America could bomb Japan's cities while Japan couldn't even threaten American territory, how could Japan possibly invade America? By 1945, the question was no longer whether Japan could invade America. The question was whether Japan could defend its own home islands from American invasion. The answer, in the minds of Japan's military planners, was no. But they would try anyway because surrender was unthinkable. They developed Operation Ketsugo, the plan to defend Japan's home islands against American invasion. Every available aircraft would be converted to kamikaze missions. Civilians would be armed with bamboo spears. The entire population would resist. Millions would die. But even in this desperate planning, the fundamental asymmetry remained. Japan was planning to defend its small islands with a population of 70 million. Already exhausted by years of war. America was preparing to invade with a military of over 12 million, backed by a population of 140 million, supported by industrial capacity that dwarfed Japan's. The atomic bombs in August 1945 ended the war before Operation Ketsugo could be tested. But the strategic reality had been clear for years. Japan could never invade America. The logistics were impossible. The geography was insurmountable. The industrial disparity was overwhelming. The American population was too large, too armed, too motivated to defend their homeland. Japanese military planners knew this from the beginning. Admiral Yamamoto knew it. Admiral Nagano knew it. Even General Tojo, for all his aggressive rhetoric, never seriously proposed landing Japanese troops in Los Angeles or San Francisco or Seattle. The war Japan fought was always defensive at its core. Seize resources in Southeast Asia. Establish a defensive perimeter. Make the war costly enough that America would negotiate. Hope that American public opinion would tire of the casualties and accept a compromise peace. But invade America. Occupy American territory. March through American cities. It was never in the plans. It was never possible. The numbers didn't work. The logistics didn't work. The geography didn't work. In the end, Japan couldn't even defend its own islands. The idea that they could invade and occupy a country twice their size, with twice their population and 10 times their industrial capacity, separated by 5,000 miles of ocean, was not just ambitious. It was absurd. The tragedy is that Japanese military planners knew this. Yamamoto told them. Nagano told them. The strategic studies told them. But the momentum toward war was unstoppable. political pressures, military culture, national pride, and the belief that Japanese fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages all pushed Japan toward a war they knew they couldn't win. After the war, in interrogations and testimonies, Japanese officers were asked about their strategic planning. Did they ever consider invading America? The answer was always the same. No, it was never realistic. They knew the numbers, they knew the distances, they knew the impossibility. One officer, asked why Japan went to war if they knew they couldn't win, gave an answer that captured the tragedy. We knew we couldn't win a long war, but we hoped we could win enough battles early to force a negotiated peace. We were wrong. The cold calculation that made invading America impossible was the same calculation that should have kept Japan out of the war entirely. But knowing the odds and acting on that knowledge are different things. Japan's military planners understood the mathematics of their strategic situation. They just couldn't stop the political and cultural forces that pushed them into war, anyway. The American mainland remained untouched throughout the war. A few balloon bombs drifted across the Pacific and landed in the western states, killing a handful of people. A Japanese submarine shelled an oil facility in California, doing minimal damage. These pinprick attacks were the extent of Japan's ability to strike American territory. Meanwhile, American forces advanced across the Pacific, taking island after island, pushing closer to Japan. American bombers turned Japanese cities to ash. American submarines strangled Japan's merchant fleet, cutting off resources from the conquered territories. American industry produced weapons and equipment in quantities that seemed impossible to Japanese observers. The war ended with Japanese cities in ruins, its military shattered, its economy destroyed, and its people starving.